Hi, this is Sean Wildermuth with Agilitrain. Today we're going to talk about building an OData data service using Visual Studio. Let's pop over to our project and we can see that I have a simple MVC project going here, so this could be used with an existing web forms project. The key is that we're going to want to expose some data that supports iQueryable or link. So in our case, let's go ahead and create a new item, add new item, and I'm going to pick an entity framework model, and I'm just going to call it our games model and generate it from a database. I'm picking a database that I have as a MDF file in our app data folder, but you could pick an existing database connection if you want as well. This doesn't require that you use SQL Server Express to do this. You could use a full SQL Server instance if you'd like. It's going and looking at the database for us, and I'm just going to say to pick all the tables. And we can see here that we're actually going to get a simple data model. Yours might be more complex, but in our case we really just have 3 pieces. Now that's all we need to do to bring in the data model. We're not going to be doing anything special for OData to make this happen at the data model level. What we really want to do is be able to add a new project type called a data service, more specifically a WCF data service. This WCF data service is the endpoint that is going to expose OData data out to the web. So I'm going to call this my games service, and this is going to build us a class file. This isn't going to generate config information or anything, just a class file. And the class file is going to take as a generic parameter the name of some object that supports a number of iQueryable properties. Now, when we built the entity framework model, it actually took each of those entities and exposed them as an iQueryable endpoint or an iQueryable property. So we can just use the games entities objects as that endpoint. Let me go ahead and format that up. And this is going to initialize, this is going to create our data service. In fact, we could navigate directly here already. Let's view this in the browser real quick. And we can see that we now have a data service. This is in a format called AtomPub. And by default, it's not going to expose any parts of your product, of your data model. So we have to actually call this entity access rule, which we see here, inside a static method called initialize service. This initialize service sets up the parameters of the service. So set entity access rule says I want to expose one of these named properties through my service, and so I'm going to go ahead and say games, and then I'm going to tell it what kind of entity rights I want to allow. In this case, I'm just going to allow us to read games. We're not going to support updating, inserting, deleting, any of that. Just read at this point. And let's view our game service again. And here we can see that we now have a collection called games. This means that we can put in games as a name of a collection from our service, and it will actually go execute through the entity framework model a query to get at all the games in the database and return them using this AtomPub format. This is what OData is. If we had requested this using this URI from a web page from JavaScript, it would also return us JSON as well, if that's important to you guys who are using jQuery and other JavaScript APIs. The API we see up here, though, is important. It actually gives us a language in order to determine our different sorts of query mechanisms. So games itself allows us to look by primary ID, and we can actually see this down here where the game ID is 1, and more importantly an href to this game is games parentheses 1. This 1 isn't an identifier like an ordinal position. It is actually the primary key of our games inside of our database. You'll have to trust me, I'm not going to bother showing you that. By looking at that, it returns in the same format just that single game. And in fact, we could decide to also use queries. So if we go look at games and use a question mark, we can actually do expand, filter equals, and then there's a query semantic here. Let's look for price is LT, which stands for less than $20. And this will actually go through and find us all the games that match that criteria. There's other filtering or query string semantics here. I'm going to put an ampersand for our next one. They all start with $, like $filter did. And I can say top equals 10. So this is going to execute that query, top equals 10. And as we look at these pieces of the URI syntax up here, one of the things you'll be aware of is that these pieces of syntax, filter, top, order by, take, they're all going to be mapped directly to link semantics. And so underneath the covers, what happens is this URI syntax gets turned into a link query, which gets executed against the underlying entity framework model. So the data service itself isn't doing filtering and sorting and those sorts of things. All it's doing is translating this URI syntax directly into a link query for us. Let's kind of walk through this. Top is interesting in that we'll get the top sections, but we also may want to ampersand $take, skip, and decide to skip a certain number. Now this skip actually needs to belong before the top, just like in a link query. You're going to skip a certain number and then take the next certain number. And by using skip and take, of course, we're going to start to get paging. So this is going to get the second page of our query semantic. And let's go ahead and throw in an order by here, ampersand $order by equals, let's put release date. And so there, it's doing the order by before it does the take and the skip, so that we're actually going to get an ordered paging semantic there. Now, back in our code, we only added an access rule for one of our 3 elements, and that means that we couldn't actually walk down through the rest of our elements. So let's go back to that game, and even though we have 2 related objects, a rating and a genre, there's no reference to them here at all except for their primary key. But this primary key is part of the data model, and so it was being exposed. It doesn't really think of it as part of that relationship. But let's go ahead and add a new access rule here for genre. Actually, genres, because the collection name is genres. If we go back here and look at our service, we'll see that, whoops, someone needs to build it. If we refresh this, we'll see we now have 2 collections, one for each of the exposed endpoints. And the more interesting part of this story is, let's go back to our game, is that the game also is going to have a link to the genre that relates to this game using an href. So you can actually walk down the path here, down the different entities. And this is important because you're going to be able to really use that REST-based syntax to get at individual entities that are part of it. In fact, it doesn't need to be just part of an individual query, like the genre of a particular game. But we can also come back here to our query. Let's say where we're getting all of the games that were less than $20. And another query semantic that becomes important is $expand equals genre. And this is going to take a path from the object that's being returned, which is a game, and embedding them. You'll have the idea of expansion or include from link, and this is the same way this does it. So if we look down here, we'll see that not only do we have this particular game, but inline in the game is the actual genre. Let's see if we can find one that is actually appropriate. There's a couple of them with empty genres, unfortunately. Always pick the ones that the property is null. Here's one. So here we've actually got inline inside of this entity is the genre for racing games. So this is being returned as part of the whole entity that happens to be, happens to be this particular game, which is the Joyride game. Make sense? So that's how to build a very simple OData service, looking at some of the query semantics. In our next section, we're going to talk about building an OData service against any form of data, not just against database data, in case you wanted to return sort of in-memory objects or some sort of objects you can't represent as a linked project like Entity Framework or Link to SQL. Thanks for joining me, and you have a good day.